It's the week ending Saturday the 30th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen public outrage over a trip to Durham by Dominic Cummings, police and protesters clashing in Minnesota over the death of an unarmed black man in custody, and Twitter for the first time tagging a tweet by President Trump with a fact-check warning. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Arion McNicoll and James Ashford, and from the Week US, it's Jessica Hullinger. And let's start by acknowledging that the UK domestic agenda has been utterly dominated by stories concerning the Prime Minister's special advisor this week. So I'm curious, Arion, you are still stranded in Australia. Has there been any talk of Dominic Cummings over there?
There has, probably not quite as much talk as there has been over there, and at least a good chunk of it has been talk that's been generated by my mouth. So I've definitely been raising the Dominic Cummings quota in this hemisphere, but no, it was news that definitely cut through and made it to Australia.
And what about you, Jess? I mean, you cover the news for an American audience. Are they at all interested in this, or does it just seem terribly provincial to them?
No one is interested in this at all. I don't even know that we covered it that much on theweek.com, if at all. Trying to explain it to a US audience is difficult. And I also think the American stance on whether or not you should be able to leave your home even under lockdown, I think a lot of people there are much more sympathetic to that view. So I don't think it would be quite as controversial there as it is here.
Yeah, particularly the whole protecting my children angle, I imagine, would go down very differently in the US. Interesting. Okay, well, we know where to go for our Cummings free news then. You go to theweek.com. Jess, okay, you are up first, actually. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is sustainable fashion finally in vogue?
For most of the types of clothes that we have in our closet, the average lifespan of these items is about 3 years. Now, I'm sure there's many of us that have gems in our drawers that are much older than that, which is great, because being able to extend the life of a garment by even only 9 months reduces the waste and water impact that garment has by 20 to 30%. But fashion is fashion, which means that styles are always going to change, and you're probably going to be wearing something different than you wear today 8 seasons from now, no matter how environmentally friendly you want to be.
Amit Kalra's TED Talk, 3 Creative Ways to Fix Fashion's Waste Problem. Jess, that was a TED Talk from 2017, so what's the story this week?
So this week, Italian fashion brand Gucci announced some major changes to how it plans to put out new clothes. So namely, it says that it wants to cut the number of fashion shows it does in a year, down from 5 to 2. So traditionally, it's been doing new lines sort of back to back to back to back and going from one fashion show to the next, and really sort of producing new clothes left and right, and sort of continuing the wasteful consumerism that comes along with fashion.
Yeah, or as fashionistas would put it, cruise, pre-fall, spring, summer, autumn, winter. That's the calendar.
Right, exactly. So it's a new look for every season, essentially. And so Gucci has said that they want to do away with this schedule and reduce the number of lines that they produce, and also the lines that they do produce will be seasonless. So in theory, there will be no distinction between the spring and summer line and the fall and winter lines. I think the idea is that you'd be able to sort of swap out the summer stuff and put a jacket over it or something and wear it in the fall and winter. And Gucci says that this is part of an effort to reduce waste in the industry and improve sustainability within the fashion industry as a whole. The creative director has said that clothes should have a longer life. And so this matters because, while luxury labels like Gucci are probably unattainable for a lot of people, myself included, they really influence the industry as a whole. They decide what looks matter. They define the fashion for the year. Their styles trickle down into our own closets. And so, I wonder if we could start to see sustainable fashion hanging in our closets soon. Will we no longer have a fall and a spring wardrobe, or will we just have, one wardrobe?
Okay, but this is a company whose revenue for last year was over £8 billion, James. They're worth a lot of money. Is this calculation by Gucci actually just realpolitik. You know, of course there aren't going to be 4 or 5 fashion shows in a year because the coronavirus has changed everything. So, you know, they've just dressed this up as a kind of ethical change, whereas actually everyone's going to have to do something like this.
Yeah, I mean, you like to think that they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, but you can't help but ignore the context in which it's being done. So we saw kind of clothing sales plummet 34% in March. It was going to make billions of pounds, the fashion industry, this year, and instead we're seeing that fall. But I guess whether it's kind of a political decision, a PR move or not, it's still a good thing. So even if they're doing it to look good, because they're such a big influential brand, it probably will have an impact on smaller brands.
Well, okay, so it's a good thing environmentally because they're not producing so much. But that's not a good thing for the people who work in the business of producing their clothes, is it? It's not a good thing necessarily for the stores that stock their clothes, for the media that cover all their launches. I mean, you know, this is business drying up for them.
I mean, I think that's a good point. I think it's true that obviously whenever any industry is getting smaller, then we have to think about the impact of the people working in that industry. But I don't think that this industry necessarily has to get smaller. It just has to change the way it's doing things. So, I mean, it makes sense that if you've got designers maybe doing, you know, they're putting on fewer shows, they might just be putting more work into the 2 shows that they're doing. I don't think that Gucci's creative directors and things are suddenly going to find themselves out of work. And I don't think that those people who, as you say, are working for a company that's making billions of dollars and are probably getting a fair whack from that themselves are the people that we really need to worry about. I think far more worrying are the people who are making the kind of the fast fashion garments in Lahore or something as a result of Gucci and its influence across the world. So, I mean, even with coronavirus, we've seen that the industry is, you know, entirely dependent on people still churning out these clothes in developing countries.
I mean, they're worth bearing in mind more, perhaps, because their plight is more desperate, Arion. But nonetheless, their business is going to dry up. And that goes for whether you're a garment maker in Lahore or whether you're a waiter or a scaffold constructor who works around Fashion Week.
Well, absolutely. But I think that the ethical side of the question that's being asked here is probably the people who are at the coalface, as it were, of actually producing garments. They probably do need to stop producing so many garments, even if it's going to impact them personally, if the decision that the world is taking is that we need to stop littering the world with, you know, the production, shipping, and then ultimately throwing away of masses and masses of clothing. So, of course, there's going to be a hit to the industry, but that is balanced against the necessity of the wastage that's going on. And I think that's an important question to be asked here.
Olly, you mentioned the sort of fashion week economy, and that's absolutely true. I mean, these are huge tentpole events for the fashion industry, and they not only prop up the industry, but they prop up cities. You know, the municipalities that host these events in New York and London and Milan and Paris. I mean, they bring in huge amounts of money for the cities, but they also are hugely wasteful. So we're not just talking about like, you know, the waste that's created by throwing away garments or creating new garments. It's also about the travel that's involved in basically flying around the world in a month, flying the entire fashion industry to these 4 cities in a short amount of time. All the models, all the press people, everybody that attends these events. I read somewhere that produces 241,000 tons of CO2 emissions a year. And that's enough, according to the New York Times, to light up Times Square for 58 years. And I mean, you got to wonder, like, do we need Fashion Week anymore? Do we need to fly all these people to a physical space when a lot of things can just be done digitally? I mean, you think about now this season, a lot of fashion weeks are going to be all online out of necessity. I don't know that we'll ever go back.
But Gucci and their like are selling a lifestyle, aren't they, Jess? And okay, yes, of course, you know, flying thousands of people around the world is not particularly environmentally friendly. But as we were hinting at anyway, their clothes are going to continue to be made in far-flung territories and flown all around the world anyway. So the Fashion Week process allows that exotic world to be broadcast to many more millions of people than whom are actually there. You know, they get to read about it in Vogue magazine, they get to watch it on fashion TV, they're being sold a dream, and that dream does include these very extravagant shows, you know, Gucci Hideout in the Necropolis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I mean, I think you also have to acknowledge that, like, Unless Gucci and these luxury brands want to bring the prices down, if they're going to make more sustainable clothing, that's really interesting. If they want to change their branding and make it less about luxury and more about, saving the planet and stuff, I think that that's a really nice message. But until they want to bring the price down, if a jumper is still going to cost me £900 from Gucci, I don't care if it's made, sustainably. I'm not going to be able to afford that. And I think you have to remember as well, this is a really nice idea. I do think there is some virtue signaling happening here. Until fast fashion gets on board and is eliminated or starts making their garments more sustainably as well, I don't know how much of an impact this is going to have. I think that it's an interesting message they're putting out there, but there's always going to be somebody who will make this stuff cheaper. How
long have you been in Britain, Jess? I love the fact that you say jumper now.
4 years, but I've been with a Brit for 10 years, so I'm well down with the
It was always the right way, and I hope you say trainers too. Arion.
Oh, I was just going to say that aside from the ethical component of what Gucci is saying, and, Alessandro Michel definitely came out and said that this is because, he wants to address the problems of fast fashion. But another fashion designer, Giorgio Armani, came out last month and said, that he thinks that luxury fashion shouldn't move at the same pace as fast fashion because he thinks it's absurd that the stuff that he designs is on the racks for 3 weeks and then it comes off and it's meant to be replaced with new clothing. So I do understand why designers in general, from an artistic point of view, would want to imagine that their clothes have a shelf life that is longer than just a number of weeks or months. So I think that ties into the question of what's going on here as well.
Do you think there's a trickle-down effect, James, to kind of high street designers? Because that's how this might, I suppose, affect more of us than just those of us who work in the fashion industry or who buy very expensive clothes.
Well, I think there is a trickle-down effect. I mean, we see that when you get kind of the high-end brands and what they're putting out, and then you get that replicated in Primark, but kind of slightly worse and for £3 instead. So I think that obviously there is the trickle-down effect in terms of people buying the same sort of clothes. And if the fashions at the top are changing slower, then I guess the fashions down for us mere mortals will change slower too. So there'll be less requirement to change your wardrobe as quickly as there is now. Saying that, I don't change my wardrobe particularly quickly. I wasn't even aware that there were 5 fashion seasons. I thought there was 4, like the actual seasons.
Do you mean to say that you didn't purchase the classic blue Oxford shirt that I can see you're wearing now in response to Gucci's latest menswear range?
I'm pretty sure I purchased this when I was 17 from Next. So,
I mean, I wonder about the other effects that coronavirus is going to have on fashion. I was driving home the other day and I saw a guy on the street wearing a suit and it just looked so weird and discordant because, business fashion is not a thing at the moment when everyone's working from home. And I wonder whether the same impact is going to be felt across the kinds of clothes that luxury manufacturers in particular make. Do you need cool dresses to go to premieres and do you need amazing suits to be seen in fabulous restaurants if those things are not going to be available to people for a long time? I just sort of wonder about
But again, that trend was happening anyway, wasn't it, Jess? We were seeing athleisure wear coming onto the catwalk over the last couple of years being a trend people were writing about. So it's just accelerating something that was happening anyway.
Oh God, our slow decline into wearing sweats all the time. It's happening. I don't know.
I should say you are, by the way, the best dressed out of the 4 of us this morning.
Well, thank you.
You seem to still be wearing business attire.
Well, somebody has to do it. But yeah, I think that it's really interesting to think about how the coronavirus will change fashion in general, as Arion says. I've been thinking about that too, because I've been buying a lot of clothes for summer online. And one of the problems that you have with buying stuff online is that you never know if any of it's going to fit you. And so I've been having to send stuff back. And I think until there's a solution to that problem, I don't know. I think we'll be buying oversized caftans because it's the only thing that's going to fit us.
Jess, fascinating story. Thank you for bringing it to the table. Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week we discovered that what's yours is less important than what's mined.
They have damaged our country without seeking advice to us, and they have damaged a whole lot of dreamings. And dreamings that were important to Aboriginal people.
Australian Aboriginal leader Galarawe Yunupingu there. So, Arion, are you finally making use of your new post down under to bring us an Australian story?
I am, yes. And in fact, Yunupingu was talking there about a different encounter of the story that happened this week, which was that earlier in the week, the mining company Rio Tinto detonated explosives in the Yukon Gorge, which is this epic landscape in Western Australia, which has all kind of enormous red cliffs and dusty trees. And the explosions destroyed two culturally significant sites that show human occupation of the land that dates back more than 46,000 years. And as well as being of archaeological interest, these sites are also sacred to the Bunni-Gurntji Guruma traditional indigenous owners of the land. And they obviously rallied around immediately and said that they were absolutely devastated about the destruction. But what's possibly worst about it all is that it was done entirely legally, and the timing is particularly insulting given that it coincides with National Reconciliation Week here in Australia, which promotes efforts to reconcile Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So it seems a particular kind of slap in the face to be blowing up sites of historical interest at a time like this.
Okay, I mean, obviously I understand the spiritual significance of the location for Aboriginal people, but do we know that archaeologically, definitely stuff of interest has been lost and the site has already been dug before, hasn't it?
Yes, and in fact, so Rio Tinto were given the opportunity to mine the land years ago, back in 2013, in fact. And they were given the opportunity to put in this mine under the old Western Australian Aboriginal heritage laws, which date back to 1972. So they're really old laws that really do favour mining companies over the objections of the traditional owners of land. But subsequent to that grant being given, an archaeological dig went in to salvage what could be brought up and dug up from the land that was going to be potentially destroyed here. And they found over 7,000 items of significance, including these ancient grindstones that were 40,000 years old, as well as this really interesting lock of interwoven human hair that current generations of Bunni-Gurntji Guruma people were able to trace through the thousands of years as their own ancestors DNA-wise. So there's all of this stuff that is potentially lost in this destruction.
Yeah, one of the examples I saw from that previous dig was what is apparently the oldest example of bone technology found in Australia, which is a kangaroo leg bone, 28,000 years old, Jess, which had been sharpened into a tool, a pointed tool to be used. I mean, that sort of thing is, it seems to me, of international heritage and importance. So it seems extraordinary that whatever the laws are, that case obviously wasn't being made with enough strength to stop Rio Tinto going ahead.
Yeah, I mean, what a waste, right? I mean, it just seems like such a shame that this stuff was lost. I don't know. I think there are lots of questions to be asked here. I mean, one of them is like how involved were the Aboriginal people in this decision? I think like that needs to be addressed. I think as well, in researching this, I hadn't realized how prominent mining was in Australia. I didn't know that Australia was the largest exporter of coal, iron ore, lead. Like I knew some of that, but not all of it. It's a shame. The land is really mineral rich, so it makes sense that this is a huge priority for the mining companies. And there's also a problem, of course, politically with the sway that these companies hold with the politicians, right? So they do a lot of lobbying and invest a lot of money in holding political sway and getting their way with this stuff. So I think I don't know, how do we empower the original landowners and the people who have, religious and spiritual connections to these landmarks? How do we allow them to have a voice? And how do we convince other people that these are landmarks worth preserving?
Well, perhaps, James, the answer to that, almost like in our last discussion where perhaps the momentum towards sustainable fashion was happening anyway before Gucci made their announcement. I mean, in the same way, there's an understanding, isn't there, that, forgive the pun, mining isn't the gold mine it used to be. People wanted to shift anyway to investing in data and AI and all those things we've talked about on this show before. And might this now be a reason for, if there is outrage about this, countries like Australia to think again about how much mining they do?
Yeah, I think it is similar in the sense that, again, it becomes a PR matter for not just Rio Tinto, but also the whole Australian government and the country of Australia, because obviously people are aware that there's a form of racism against Aboriginal people in Australia, like there's of racism in most countries. And I think that people will be rightly pointing to this and saying, is that this not just another example of that racism? Where Aboriginal people are being treated as second class, and their needs and their kind of culture being disrespected in some way. So hopefully this will be maybe a catalyst if there is an international backlash. I mean, we're talking about it, we all think it's not okay. Most people will think it's probably not okay. In the UK, you can't even build a conservatory on most buildings because they might be listed to some extent. So it's weird that those laws don't exist to protect something much, much more important in somewhere like Australia. But they are apparently putting in new laws. So I think the Aboriginal Heritage Act has been up for review for some time now, since around 2012. It was put forward by the former Liberal government, then it was rejected. But then recently it's come back, and the Aboriginal Affairs Minister, Ben Wyatt in Australia, has now pushed that consultation back again, though, because of the coronavirus pandemic. So it's kind of the can's getting kicked down the road again. But hopefully they won't have the excuse to kick it down further when the pandemic has kind of, it's already, as Arion was saying earlier, we've already seen that the rules are slightly more relaxed in Australia than they are here. So maybe if the pandemic's going to be less on people's minds, then this can come more to the forefront.
And what about that undercurrent of racism that James alluded to? Sitting here in the UK, just Googling my way around this story, I found a link to ABC News in Australia who were describing the story much like the BBC might. But aside from that, to find a voice that seemed genuinely sort of animated and representing the Aboriginal point of view, I basically had to go to Facebook. There didn't seem to be a media organisation that was really getting upset about this.
That's really hard. And prior to British people arriving in Australia, there were estimated to be about 300,000 to 1.5 million Aborigines across the country of various groups and Torres Strait Islanders. And by 1901, that was down to 100,000. So the genocide that occurred here was completely devastating. And you're right, it can be quite hard to hear Aboriginal voices connected to this, not least of all because they continue to be excluded from so much of the machinery of power. And one of the big problems with, that 1972 Act in Western Australia to do with mining of traditional lands is that it didn't allow for or require Indigenous people to be part of the consultation process. So that was one of the things that Ben Wyatt was trying to overturn prior to his new updated legislation being kicked down the road, as James was saying. So there's just so many ways in which those Aboriginal voices need to be heard more.
It's also easy to see the destruction of something significant when it's man-made, I would venture controversially as well. Maybe part of the situation here is that because Aboriginal people essentially worship the natural world, it's not as straightforward as pointing to a historic temple or the Wailing Wall or Notre Dame Cathedral and saying these bricks are important because so-and-so died here or so-and-so prayed here. It's just a mountain. If you're not religious, it's hard to see the significance in a way that you might if it was bricks and mortar.
I think that's true. And there certainly were man-made objects that were destroyed here or were likely to have been destroyed here. But you're right, it's less easy to get your head around the significance of something that is small and fashioned from bone rather than, say, the Taj Mahal or whatever. But I do think that stuff is certainly important. And as you're saying, Olly, the Aboriginal spirituality is so bound up in what the land is all about that it means that destruction of any particular tract may well be problematic spiritually for an Indigenous group. So I think that is an important thing to note.
And it's important, I think we acknowledge now the importance of protecting the natural world for the simple fact that it is the natural world. So we want the barrier reefs and things to be protected. So I don't think it's unusual that we would want to protect those in their own right as something natural and beautiful. And Arion was describing it earlier very poetically. I think, there's justification to protect those things for themselves, but then you add the fact that they've got this cultural significance to them. And it's baffling.
All right, James, you will continue to unbaffle us after this. OK, James, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Why the Premier League could draw a line in the sand over the purchase of Newcastle United.
Now, MBS is of course not the first Gulf monarch to buy a football club. Both Qatar, with the 2022 World Cup and PSG, and the UAE with their purchase of Manchester City, have invested heavily in the game. And they weren't interested in profit. They were after something else. Reputation laundering, sports washing, and the chance to offer an alternative story about the country to the rest of the world. There is no greater billboard than televised European football, especially in the Premier League and Champions League. And the Saudi state now appears to want a part of that.
A clip from a video on Tifo Football's YouTube channel called Who Are Newcastle's Prospective New Owners? Well, James, who are Newcastle's prospective new owners?
Newcastle's prospective new owners are Saudi Arabia, essentially. It's a Saudi investment fund, which is kind of headed, as everything in Saudi Arabia, by MBS. So MBS is planning a £300 million takeover of Newcastle United Football Club, but that takeover is now in jeopardy because it's been ruled that the Saudis are behind a massive illegal sports streaming platform called BeOutQ, which basically it's a pirate satellite TV and streaming service. So whereas the Premier League sells its rights to its streaming of football matches, BeOutQ nicks it and streams it for free, basically, meaning the Premier League lose money, which they don't like to do. So they're now considering not letting Saudi Arabia buy Newcastle United.
I mean, that seems to me the least controversial aspect of Saudi Arabian ownership, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's weird that there was all this stuff about kind of the morals and the ethics of letting Saudi Arabia, who just are massive human rights abusers, buy the club, and the Premier League was saying, oh yeah, we're considering it, it's really bad, we'll definitely look at that. But essentially it was going to go ahead like it has every time some kind of foreign war criminal, someone has wanted to buy a club in the UK. But now, because it's about rights and because it's about money, the Premier League is saying, hold on, we can't let this happen. So the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has written this report which basically says that Saudi Arabia are behind BeOutQ, which I think everybody kind of knew because they'd refused to stop it from streaming in the country despite the Premier League and other massive sports leagues around the world saying, please stop letting it happen.
But Jess, it isn't selling arms, is it? And the British government does do that, or did do that until very recently with Saudi Arabia. It is just selling a football team. It isn't life and death.
No, it's not life and death, but it is sort of being involved with a country that does kill people. I mean, one of the main motivations here, or suspected motivations, is that MBS basically wants to whitewash the fact that they killed Jamal Khashoggi, and the journalist that was killed in 2018. And his fiance appealed to the Premier League and said, please don't let this sale go through. This is a clear effort to sort of swoop in and rescue a struggling team. I mean, the current owner, Mike Ashley, is really hated. I mean, the fans of Newcastle just really hate him, and for various very good reasons. And so the fans are really desperate for new ownership. And something like 97% of the fans say that they would be happy for this sale to go through to this investment fund. But yeah, the fiance of Jamal Khashoggi said, this is ridiculous. Like, please don't participate in this rebranding of Saudi Arabia. What does it say as a country if we're participating in that kind of thing?
Arion, what does it say if you're participating in that kind of thing? It's a private enterprise, effectively, isn't it? The club and its members, as Jess was saying, are keen to do it.
I think that's quite interesting, the wishes of the fans. And, you can almost understand why in the era of, as it's called, financial doping in the Premier League, where the clubs that tend to win are the ones that have the most money behind them, and the money tends to be coming from really powerful people or really rich states. And so you can understand why fans might be keen on maybe overlooking some of the questionable aspects of a future owner and just being willing to take all comers if it means being able to compete for trophies. And certainly I'm an Arsenal fan, and a couple of years ago there was a sort of rumbling of the idea that this chap called Alisher Usmanov, who's a Russian oligarch of fairly questionable morals, was talking about making some sort of a bid for the club. And there was quite a lot of enthusiasm among fans for the idea of kind of letting this guy in just because it would mean that we'd have access to his Gazprom from billions. And I think that there is that side of it that is certainly driving the debate from the fans' perspective. But on the other hand, I think that football fans in particular have had their minds sharpened to human rights abuses more recently by the awarding of the World Cup to Qatar several years back. And I think that both Qatar's behaviour in general as a state, and then specifically what has gone on in the construction efforts towards putting on the World Cup in 2022 has made people kind of more questioning of the idea of overlooking human rights abuses full stop. And certainly in the bidding process to host the 2026 World Cup, which was eventually won by Canada, Mexico and the USA, FIFA built in human rights into the selection process and looked at all of the states that were bidding. And, so it's something that's on people's minds now.
But all of that's very well, but that was before the world fell off a cliff. I mean, we do need to look at this in a kind of post-coronavirus world, don't we, James? I mean, as a kind of microcosm of the decisions everyone's going to have to be taking in business, Newcastle United turning to a very wealthy country that has this huge supply of oil and therefore loads of money from oil is exactly what the British government's going to be doing. It's what all our banks are going to be doing. Qatar invested in Barclays in the last depression, so that's what's going to happen, isn't it? I mean, we're all going to be looking to MBS for money.
Yeah, I think the British government being scared of losing foreign investment is kind of a strand that goes through this and has gone through our relationship with Saudi Arabia for years. I mean, despite the fact that MBS was overseeing this massive bombing campaign in Yemen, displacing millions of citizens, killing tens of thousands, we still thought it was okay to let BAE Systems sell them 15 billion worth of arms over the last 5 years. So it's not like the government can necessarily take a massive stand here, and it would look kind of quite weird if they did over this issue and they hadn't over other issues. But I still think that, I mean, you said before it's not a question of life or death, but it is a question of life or death, because doing PR for these kind of regimes becomes a question of life or death. So whilst this transaction might not get anybody killed, hopefully, I still think that the fact that the Saudi regime could launder its reputation so extensively that it could get away with other things means that it becomes a question of life or death. So, I mean, we were talking earlier about the 2018 World Cup in Russia. So I think MBS actually attended the opening ceremony of that in Russia as a big guest of honour. Later that year, he went on to, the international community agrees, kind of approve the killing of Khashoggi. So I think that it becomes about life and death when you let a regime get away with what it wants, whenever it wants, because of their money and their influence. And I think on the influence point, that's what this is all about, because the UK admits openly, as do most countries, that sport is soft power. We've got military, we've got intelligence, we've got trade, but then we've got cultural exports. The BBC is a cultural export. The government doesn't continue to fund it because it loves it so much. It funds it because it makes us look good when we can put the World Service out, putting a kind of Western British view of things across the world. And we see the same thing with the Premier League. It's an export. We're putting British institutions, around the world. So I think that we have to recognise that sport is soft power, and soft power is power. And power lets you do things that are good or bad. And Saudi Arabia tends to do things that are bad.
I also wonder if it raises the question of how much accountability and regulation and transparency should we have in the world of sports and in the people who own our sports clubs and our teams. This is not the first time that an owner has been exposed to have been corrupt and horrible. So I don't know. I mean, how can we hold them to account more? How can we make there be more transparency? How can we encourage the fans to get more involved and have more of a stake in who runs their teams? I don't know. I think that if anything, this exposes a lack of transparency at the top. I mean, it's good that the WTO is cracking down on this, and it seems like probably the sale won't go through, but yeah, the fact that it's come so close and that the fans are really rabid for it, despite the human rights abuses, I think I don't know. I find it really disheartening.
The Premier League is just a giant monopoly board, isn't it? Everyone involved is there because they've got more money and they can buy up the next thing. It is an international export. It's the biggest football league in the world. So we're beyond the point where we can say, oh, we need to have a few more safeguards over the money involved and who gets involved. The whole thing operates on outstanding levels of money.
That's true. Might be wishful thinking to say that it could be reformed. I mean, again, I do find it encouraging. I mean, I kind of wonder if the WTO is just saying that we're going to take our wins where we can, and if we're not going to convince the Premier League that human rights violations are enough to prevent them from going through with the sale, we're going to find something else. So there might be that to consider. But I don't know. I'm trying to be optimistic and hope that coming out of this, that we'll think better about letting corrupt people run the country. I don't know. That's very, very wishful thinking.
Well, as referee, I am now going to blow the whistle on this edition of The Week Unwrapped. Thanks to today's top squad of Arion, Jess and James. Remember to send us your feedback on Twitter. No red cards, please. We are at Week Unwrapped. You can also listen to our entire back catalogue. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.